closer.
The city never slept, but Zara wished it would. She stood beneath the broken awning of an old bookshop on Crescent Lane, clutching her coat as rain hammered the cobblestones. It was past midnight, and every taxi that splashed through the puddles was already occupied. She had nowhere to go, her apartment was 3 miles away, her phone was dead, and the storm showed no mercy. Then she heard footsteps in the alley beside her. A man stepped out of the darkness, tall, shadowed beneath a black hood, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment neither of them spoke. His eyes were dark amber, almost golden, catching the faint glow of a distant street lamp. He looked at her the way people look at things they recognize but cannot name. "You're going to catch a fever standing there," he said, his voice low and unhurried, like a river at night. He unwrapped the brown paper. It was a second coat, old but thick, and held it out without explanation. Zara hesitated. She had been taught her whole life not to take things from strangers. But the rain was cold, and something in his eyes was not. She took the coat. His name, she would learn later, was Denial. The only place open at that hour was a small all-night cafe called Ember, the kind of place that smelled of burned sugar and old newspapers, where the chairs were mismatched and the ceiling fan moved too slowly to be useful. Denial offered to walk her there since the rain had turned the lane into a shallow river. They walked close, not touching, but aware of the space between them the way you are aware of a flame near your skin. They ordered coffee. Then more coffee. Zara told him she was an architect who had come to this part of the city to sketch a heritage building that had since been demolished. Denial listened the way people rarely listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving her words. He told her almost nothing about himself. Only that he was passing through. Only that he had been passing through for 3 years. By the time the sky went from black to deep gray, they had talked about music neither of them could find the words for, cities they had visited alone, and the strange sadness of waking up in the morning with no one to tell your dreams to. When the cafe owner began stacking chairs around them, they both laughed, the soft, startled laugh of people who forgot what time it was. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled clean and new. At the door of the cafe, Zara handed him back the coat. He shook his head. "Keep it." She looked at him for a long moment, searching for something she did not have a name for. Then she did something she would think about for weeks afterward. She took a pen from her bag and wrote her address on the inside flap of the coat's pocket. Not her number. Her address. She was not entirely sure why. Denial looked down at it. Then he looked at her. There was something careful in his expression, the look of a man who wanted very much to step forward but had learned the hard way to hesitate. "I might be gone by morning," he said quietly. Zara nodded. "Then it will just be an address," she replied, and walked away into the new pale light without looking back, her heart beating like she had just done something irreversible. She was right. It was irreversible. He came to that address 8 days later, at dusk, with no explanation and a bunch of white flowers she had never seen before. Small, wild, the kind that grew between cracks in old walls. She opened the door and said nothing for a breath. Then she stepped aside to let him in. That moment, that small sideways step, was the beginning of everything. Over the following weeks, a quiet world built itself between Zara and Denial. A world with its own language, its own hours, its own geography. He would arrive in the evenings and leave before the neighborhood woke. They did not talk about what they were to each other. They cooked meals that turned into long conversations, took walks in parts of the city that neither of them knew well, sat on her rooftop watching lights flicker on in distant windows and wondering about the lives inside. Zara began to notice things about him. The way he checked exits when they entered any room, the way he sometimes fell silent mid-sentence as if catching himself before saying too much. He was carrying something. She could feel the weight of it the way you feel a wall in the dark without seeing it. She did not push. She had her own walls, and she respected his. One evening he brought his sketchbook. She did not know he drew. Inside were hundreds of pages, buildings, cityscapes, doors. No people. She turned each page slowly and said nothing until the end. "You draw like someone who's looking for a place to stay," she said. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I've been looking for a long time." She closed the book and put her hand over his. It was the first time they touched with intention. It was Denial who broke first, on a cold Thursday when the city was wrapped in fog so thick it felt like the outside world had disappeared. He sat at her kitchen table and told her who he was, or who he had been. He was not dangerous. But he was wanted by people who were. Years ago, he had witnessed something in a city far from here, and rather than stay silent the way everyone had advised, he had spoken. And so he had been moving ever since, from city to city, like a sentence that cannot find its ending. Zara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question: "Are you afraid right now in this kitchen?"
He looked up.
"No," he said, and she could hear the truth in it like a note struck on a clean string. She told him that was enough for her. That fear was not the measure of danger, that some things were worth being brave for even when the outcome was unknown. He looked at her as if she had said something in a language he had forgotten he knew. That night they stayed up until 3 a.m. making a plan, not to run and not to stay recklessly, but to build something careful and real together. A plan made of ordinary things, a city they both liked, a neighborhood neither of them had tried, the possibility of waking up in the same place for more than 8 days. It was, Zara thought, the most romantic conversation she had ever had, because it was the most honest. There was a small abandoned garden 3 streets from Zara's apartment. Technically a private plot but long forgotten by whoever owned it, its iron gate permanently bent open by a fallen tree. Zara had sketched it once for a restoration project that never received funding. She brought Denial there one night and they sat among the overgrown roses and broken stone paths, and she told him it was her favorite place in the city precisely because nobody claimed it. "Things that belong to no one are free," she said, lying back on the grass to look at the narrow strip of sky between the old garden walls. Denial lay beside her, and for a while they just breathed and listened to the city hum beyond the wall. He reached over and took her hand, not gently, not tentatively, but with the certainty of someone who had decided. She turned her head and found him already looking at her. He kissed her among the untended roses, in a garden the city had forgotten, under a sky too light polluted to see stars. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet one, the kind that contains an entire conversation, that says, "I have been moving for so long and I think I was moving toward this." Zara closed her eyes and felt, for the first time in years, completely still. It came, as it always does, on an ordinary morning. Zara came downstairs to find Denial standing in the middle of the room with his bag packed, his face drawn and pale. Someone had found him, not the people he feared, but someone from his past, a friend turned reluctant messenger. The case he had fled was reopening, and there were people who needed him to testify in person. If he did, the shadow over his life could finally be lifted. But it meant returning to the city he had escaped. Zara stood very still and listened. Then she asked, "What happens if you don't go?" He said, "I keep running." She said, "And if you do go?"
He said, "It ends.
One way or another, it ends." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was holding a feeling she didn't want to drop. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below, at the ordinary world going to work in the early light, unaware of all the large things happening in small apartments above. Then she turned and said, "I'm coming with you." Denial shook his head immediately. She walked to him and stood close. "I'm an architect," she said. "I know how to hold things up while they're being repaired." He looked at her for a long moment, and something cracked open in his expression, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been alone in something for too long. He did not argue again. The city they returned to was Denial's ghost, every street a memory, every face a possible threat. He had left it in darkness and he returned to it in winter. Zara stayed close, her presence steady and uncomplicated in the way that strong people are when they have decided to be strong for someone else. They stayed in a small hotel near the courthouse, and at night Denial would lie awake and Zara would talk to him, about architecture, about the garden, about nothing, until his breathing slowed. The day of the testimony, she waited outside the courtroom on a wooden bench for 4 hours. She brought a book but did not read it. She counted the tiles on the floor. She watched people come and go, lawyers with briefcases, witnesses with pale faces, clerks carrying stacks of folders. She thought about all the ways buildings were held up by parts you couldn't see. She thought about how Denial's voice had sounded when he finally told his story, and how brave it was to say true things in a room full of strangers. When he came out, he stood in the corridor for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened them and found her on the bench, looking back at him. He walked to her and sat down beside her and took a very long, very quiet breath.
"It's done," he said.
She put her head on his shoulder and felt the tension slowly leave him, like a held note finally released. Outside, it had begun to snow for the first time that season. 3 months later, they moved into an apartment in a city that belonged to neither of them, which made it, as Zara pointed out, entirely theirs. It was a third-floor flat with tall windows and a kitchen that smelled of old wood, on a street where the neighbors nodded but did not pry. Denial hung his sketchbooks on the wall, all of them, the hundreds of drawings of buildings and doors and cityscapes. Zara stood back and looked at them.
"You were drawing your way home," she said.
He found work designing small things, furniture, door frames, the interiors of other people's dreams. She continued her architecture. They had different rhythms and the same hours, and they learned each other's silences the way you learn a room in the dark, by feel, by memory, by trust.
There were still hard nights.
There were still moments when Denial went quiet in a way that meant he was somewhere else. But Zara had learned to sit nearby without pulling him back, to let the quiet pass like weather. One evening, a year after the rain-soaked night on Crescent Lane, Zara found a piece of paper slipped under the kitchen sugar bowl. On it, in Denial's careful handwriting, was an address. Her address, copied from the inside of the old coat pocket. Below it he had written, "I have arrived." She stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, holding the note. Then she laughed, the full, bright, unguarded laugh of someone who is completely irreversibly home.